And I didn't realize like what a microcap Facebook was because all of these other like big ones have like crossed the $1 trillion mark a long time ago. And finally, Facebook hitting $1 trillion. All those other ones, Microsoft, Apple, they did it a long time ago. Joining us now, David Kirkpatrick, author of The Facebook Effect. You know, David, if I'm being honest, these lawsuits, they get announced by various states or someone in D.C. or the European Union. I lose track of them, but I think today is a good reminder, like, it's really hard to put a dent in these companies.
Yeah, Joe, you're right. And it's hard to keep track of all the actions against Facebook, but let's keep that in mind. If there's that many actions, they're not necessarily out of the woods. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that is pretty increasingly apparent, given the range of different types of governmental pushback that are going against Facebook and the other net giants, is that it's more likely that legislation is in the end going to be their biggest problem rather than regulatory action, even though both will continue. Today, some major regulatory efforts by the FTC in the states were thrown out. But it's significant. Just last week, 6 bills were voted out of the House Antitrust Subcommittee that would also seriously affect this company.
Yeah, several bills coming out, including H.R. 3816, which a lot of people think could be one of the ones that actually makes it to the finish line and the president's desk. Of course, David, we also know that it's a little bit easier sometimes for companies to, I guess, sway legislation than sway the courts here. Is there a sense here that even if Facebook does win the legal battles here, that any new legislation, the new laws that come out of Congress, could actually be a little bit more damaging than whatever current cases are out there?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Facebook is certainly going to do its darndest to try to sway legislators, but there is tremendous anger on both sides of the aisle against Facebook in Washington and also among many parties in Europe and other parts of the world. Keep that in mind. But one thing that I think is not being remarked on too much yet, because this is such new news, but, you know, if I was a legislator in Washington who saw these bills coming out last week and was on the fence, you know, and I really don't like their actions, but maybe I don't really want to support those bills, I might be more inclined to support those bills after today. If it looks like the FTC is failing and the states aren't going to do it, maybe we in Congress have to do it. So it could really be a little bit of a bolstering for some or all of those bills after today.
And meanwhile, I mean, the FTC, I thought, was meant to be helmed by, you know, a real anti-tech voice coming to the helm, but clearly not to this extent. How much, though, we can't sort of broad brush sort of say all of big tech are going to be affected in an equal manner. I mean, do you think that what form does legislation really take? Many people like to talk about a breaking up of certain business models, but do you think that becomes a reality, David?
Well, one of the bills would certainly set the grounds for potential breakup. So it's not out of the question. I frankly think it's unlikely that most of the most draconian bills, there's 3 that are really, really negative on breakup, on restricting purchasing of new companies, and on not favoring their own services. I think though some version of each of those may pass, they will get significantly watered down from the way they are today. So, you know, but the big message still is, in my opinion, these companies have to fear governments. We are in an untenable situation in the United States and globally that we have allowed a small number of companies to gain such vast power with essentially no governmental oversight. That is not going to continue, despite however happy investors might be today.
Is that really the issue? I mean, people talk about antitrust, and the problem seems to be that a lot of the sort of traditional measures of antitrust don't necessarily fit very well. But what you're describing is kind of something a little different. It's just a raw exercise of power. The fact that, say, a Facebook has so much influence over who gets to speak and who gets to have a voice and who gets to have a platform and arguably who even gets to run for office if they have access to it. Is that really the sort of like thrust of what keeps politicians that want to keep their feet to the fire on this?
Well, politicians are of mixed mind because some of them
Sure.
have tremendously benefited from Facebook's power to determine the dialogue and influence politics. And let's face it, their influence in politics is probably the single most obvious way that their macro power has been distorting society in recent years. And I do think, the European Digital Services Act, what it's going to do, and that was introduced this last year and is going to be almost certainly acted upon within the next year or two. It's going to take a while. That will significantly restrict and change the way they have to manage their content. And that may be the place where the reforms are most needed. And ultimately, none of the bills that were passed out of the House exactly target that, interestingly. It's how they moderate information, particularly political information and hate speech and all that, that has probably gotten people more upset than any other single phenomenon in terms of their failures, because there are a lot of failures these companies have had. But I think the Europeans are a little more methodical about how they're approaching this. But look, it's not just sheer power. It is power that has distorted politics and is distorting the economy, and those things are not going to be allowed to stand long term.